When Cowboy Sebastian heard the Apache sisters whispering in their native tongue, thinking he was fast asleep, his blood ran cold. They knew exactly who he was, and they had come for something he'd buried deep in his past. The storm outside wasn't the real danger. It was the secret they carried, one that could either save his soul or send him to an early grave. But would Sebastian choose to face the truth they brought to his doorstep, or would he remain the coward he'd become? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind screamed across the barren stretch of Crimson Flats, New Mexico Territory, 1891, carrying with it the scent of rain that would never fall and the weight of sins that would never wash away. Sebastian Drake had learned to read the desert like other men read newspapers. Every shift in the air, every change in the light told a story. Tonight's story was one of violence. His shack sat alone, 15 miles from the nearest settlement of Broken Spine, a town that barely deserved the name. It was little more than a collection of desperate souls clinging to the fantasy that silver veins ran deeper than they did. Sebastian had chosen this isolation deliberately 3 years ago when he'd ridden away from his life as a federal marshal, his badge left behind in a pool of someone else's blood. The knock came just as the first fat drops of rain began to hammer against his tin roof. Sebastian didn't move from where he sat at his crude wooden table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him, and a loaded Springfield rifle within arm's reach. Visitors meant trouble. They always did. Out here, honest folks knew better than to travel at night, and dishonest folks knew better than to knock. The voice that followed was unexpected, a woman's voice, speaking in rapid, urgent Apache dialect. "Shidiji is hurt. We need shelter." Just until dawn, Sebastian's hand moved to the rifle, but he didn't lift it. Through the gap in his poorly fitted door, he could see 2 silhouettes backlit by lightning. Both women, one supporting the other. The injured one's posture spoke of serious pain, the kind that came from a bullet or a blade, not a twisted ankle. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the weathered boards. The taller woman, strong-shouldered, with traditional Apache dress now soaked and clinging to her frame, stared directly at his hiding spot as if she could see through the wood. Her eyes held no pleading, only a fierce calculation. The younger one, Elena, he would later learn, slumped against her sister, one hand pressed to her rib cage, where dark wetness spread across the fabric. "There's a mission in Broken Spine," Sebastian called out in English, his voice deliberately flat and unwelcoming. "Padre Garcia takes in strays. You do better there. My sister will die before we reach Broken Spine," the tall one responded, switching to English with barely a trace of accent. "You have medical supplies? I can see the lamp oil burning. You're awake. You're armed. And you're alone. We're not here to rob you, cowboy. We're here because we have no other choice." Something in her tone, not desperation, but a kind of resigned pragmatism, made Sebastian pause. She wasn't begging. She was stating facts. Women didn't travel alone through Apache territory at night unless they were running from something worse than the desert itself. His hand left the rifle and moved to the door bolt. "You've got until sunrise," he said, pulling the door open just wide enough for them to slip through. "Then you're gone. No questions, no conversation, no trouble." "Ah-hee-hee," the tall one said. "Thank you" in Apache, though her tone suggested she owed him nothing, as they stepped into the dim light of his single oil lamp. Sebastian got his first clear look at them. The taller sister had the bearing of a warrior, not the romantic notion that dime novels sold, but the real thing. Her hands, though graceful, bore the calluses of someone who'd worked leather, handled weapons, and survived. Her face was striking, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of his shabby home, searching for threats and exits in equal measure. The younger one, Elena, was smaller, more delicate in features, but with that same underlying steel. Her face had gone grey with pain, and the wound in her side was seeping fresh blood through the makeshift bandage. "Bullet," Sebastian asked, his marshal's instincts kicking in despite himself. "Knife," the tall one replied. 3 hours ago? The bleeding won't stop. Sebastian gestured toward his cot in the corner. "Put her there." He moved to a battered trunk in the corner, pulling out a leather medical kit, one of the few things he'd kept from his former life. "I'll need to clean it properly. You got a name, or should I just call you Trouble?" "Elena," she said, helping her sister onto the cart. "And this is Elena. Don't care." Sebastian cut her off, though he caught the flash of something in Elena's eyes. Was it recognition? Impossible. He'd been nobody for 3 years. Just another failed prospector drinking himself to death in the territory's forgotten corners. He worked on Elena's wound with practiced efficiency. The cut was deep, jagged, the kind that came from a hunting knife wielded with intent to kill, not just wound. Whoever had done this wanted her dead and had nearly succeeded. As he cleaned and stitched, Elena bit down on a leather strap, her eyes never leaving his face. "You've done this before," Elena observed, standing close enough to intervene if he made a wrong move, but far enough to respect his work. "I've done a lot of things before," Sebastian replied, not looking up. The storm outside intensified, rain now coming down in sheets that turned the world beyond his walls into a roaring chaos. They were stuck together, at least until dawn. Sebastian finished the stitching, bandaged the wound with clean cloth and stepped back. "She needs rest and water. There's a canteen by the stove. Help yourself." Elena moved to tend her sister, and Sebastian retreated to the far corner of his single-room shack, deliberately putting distance between them. He sat on an old ammunition crate, his back to the wall, and watched them with the wariness of a man who'd learned that mercy often came back to bite you. Elena's breathing eventually steadied, the color returning to her face. Elena sat beside her, one hand resting protectively on her sister's shoulder. For a long moment, the only sounds were the storm and Elena's soft, pained breathing. Then Elena looked directly at Sebastian, and he saw it again, that flicker of recognition in her dark eyes. "You're Sebastian Drake," she said quietly. Not a question. A statement. Sebastian's blood went cold. Nobody knew that name out here. Nobody should. He'd buried Sebastian Drake, the federal marshal, alongside his badge and his honor 3 years ago in a town called Widow's Creek. "You're mistaken," he said, his hand drifting toward the rifle leaning against the wall beside him. "No," Elena said, her voice carrying an unsettling certainty. "I'm not. You were at Fort Redemption 3 years ago. You were investigating land fraud. You wore a marshal's badge then, and you had a scar above your right eye." She gestured to the thin white line barely visible beneath his hat brim, "from a fight in a saloon in Santa Fe." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "A lot of men have scars. Not a lot of men watched my husband die and did nothing to stop it." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sebastian's world tilted. The woman before him wasn't just any Apache woman seeking shelter. She was the widow of Thomas Running Bear, the Apache translator and land advocate who'd been building a case against Colonel Raymond Hutchins, the military officer who'd been systematically defrauding the Apache and Navajo tribes of their treaty lands. 3 years ago, Sebastian had been assigned to investigate the same case. He'd been close, so close to exposing Hutchins when everything went sideways. Thomas Running Bear had evidence, documents that would have destroyed Hutchins's career and landed him in federal prison. But Hutchins had gotten to Thomas first. Sebastian had been there. He'd seen Hutchins's men corner Thomas in an alley behind the fort's supply depot. He'd watched them beat him, interrogate him about the documents. And when Thomas refused to talk, he'd watched them kill him slowly, viciously, making it look like a drunken brawl gone wrong. And Sebastian had done nothing. He'd been outnumbered 5-1. He'd been unarmed, having left his weapons behind when he'd gone to meet an informant. He'd told himself that intervening would have meant his death too, and a dead marshal couldn't bring justice, so he'd hidden. He'd watched, and when Hutchins's men had finally left Thomas's broken body in the dirt, Sebastian had walked away. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next day, Hutchins had come to him with an offer, a satchel full of gold coins, a horse, and a promise that if Sebastian disappeared, his family back in Virginia would be left alone. If he stayed and testified, well, accidents happened all the time on the frontier. Sebastian had taken the gold. He'd ridden away. He'd become the coward he saw every time he looked in a mirror. "You were there," Elena said, her voice hard as desert stone. "Thomas told me about you. He said you were honest, that you could be trusted. He was going to give you the documents the next day." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "Instead they killed him, and you vanished like smoke." Sebastian couldn't meet her gaze. "I couldn't stop them." "You didn't try." The accusation hit harder than any fist. Because it was true. Elena stirred on the cot, murmuring something in Apache. Elena immediately turned her attention to her sister, checking the bandage, whispering soothing words. Sebastian watched them, these two women who'd somehow tracked him down in the middle of nowhere, and realized this wasn't a chance encounter. They'd come looking for him. "Why are you here?" Sebastian asked, his voice rough. "If you know who I am, you know I'm worthless." "I can't help you." Elena turned back to him, and for the first time he saw something other than accusation in her eyes. He saw calculation, strategy, "because you're the only one who was there," she said. "You're the only witness who can testify against Hutchins. Thomas's documents survived, we have them. But without your testimony, without someone who saw what happened, they're just paper. Hutchins is too powerful, too protected. He's destroyed every other witness, bought every judge in the territory. So you want me to sign my own death warrant," Sebastian said bitterly. "Hutchins will kill me the moment I surface." "Probably," Elena agreed. "But you'll die with your honor restored. Or you can keep living like this." She gestured at the squalid shack. "The empty whiskey bottle, the life of a man already dead. And die a coward's death anyway, forgotten and alone." Sebastian's hands clenched into fists. Every word was a knife twisting in old wounds. "Get some sleep," he finally said, standing abruptly. "We'll talk more in the morning." He moved to the back corner of his shack, separated from the main room by a thin curtain of canvas. His sleeping area, if it could be called that, consisted of a bedroll, a saddle for a pillow, and his rifle. He lay down fully clothed, his gun within reach. But he didn't sleep. He listened. He'd learned years ago as a marshal that people revealed their truest selves when they thought they weren't being observed. In the darkness, with only the sound of rain and wind, people whispered their secrets, made their plans, showed their real intentions. So Sebastian lay perfectly still, breathing slow and steady the way a sleeping man would. And he waited. An hour passed. Then another. Elena's breathing had evened out. She was genuinely asleep, the exhaustion and trauma finally claiming her. But Elena remained awake. He could tell by the small sounds, the shift of fabric, the quiet creak of the cot as she adjusted her position. Then finally she spoke, in Apache, quietly, as if to herself or to her sleeping sister. "Shadiji, we found him. The one with the quiet death in his eyes. The one Thomas called Drake." Sebastian's pulse quickened. He kept his breathing steady, fighting the urge to react. Elena continued, her voice a whisper barely audible over the storm. "He looks older, broken. The scar is still there, just as Thomas described." "It's him." A long pause. Then Elena murmured something. She wasn't as deeply asleep as Sebastian had thought. "What if he refuses?" Elena asked, her voice weak with pain. "What if he runs again?" "Then we use the second plan," Elena replied, her tone hardening. "We have the letters. We have Thomas's journal. Drake doesn't know it, but Thomas wrote about him, about their conversations, about the investigation. If Drake won't testify willingly, we'll force his hand. We'll expose him as the coward who let my husband die. His name will be ruined worse than it already is." Sebastian's chest tightened. Blackmail. They were planning to blackmail him. And if that doesn't work? Elena pressed. There was a long, heavy silence. When Elena spoke again, Her voice carried a chilling finality. Then we make sure Hutchins knows exactly where to find Sebastian Drake. Let the Colonel finish what he started 3 years ago. Either way, justice comes. Either Drake redeems himself and helps us destroy Hutchins, or he dies knowing he betrayed everyone who ever trusted him. Sebastian's blood ran ice cold. These women hadn't come seeking help. They'd come seeking revenge or redemption, depending on his choice. They'd tracked him across 3 years and hundreds of miles, carrying documents and evidence and a plan that would either save him or destroy him. Elena's voice dropped even lower, almost inaudible. Thomas believed in him once. He said Drake was a good man, trapped in an impossible situation. I want to believe that too, Shidiji. I want to believe some part of that good man still exists. And if it doesn't, Elena whispered, then we'll bury him alongside Thomas's memory, Elena replied, and find another way. The conversation ended. Elena settled back on the floor beside her sister's cot, and within minutes, her breathing had evened into genuine sleep. But Sebastian lay awake, staring at the canvas ceiling of his shack, his mind racing. They knew everything. They had evidence he didn't know existed. And they'd given him a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, redemption or destruction. The storm outside began to fade, the rain softening to a gentle patter. Dawn was still hours away, but Sebastian knew he wouldn't sleep. He'd spent 3 years running from his past, hiding in the desert, drowning his guilt in whiskey and isolation. Now his past had found him, in the form of 2 Apache sisters carrying the ghost of a murdered man and a demand for justice. Sebastian Drake closed his eyes, not to sleep but to think, because tomorrow, when the sun rose, he would have to decide who he was going to be, the coward who ran, or the man who finally stood and fought, and whatever he chose, nothing would ever be the same again. The first light of dawn crept through the cracks in Sebastian's shack like an unwelcome interrogator, exposing everything he'd tried to keep hidden. He hadn't slept, couldn't sleep, not after what he'd heard. His mind had spent the dark hours replaying every word Elena had whispered, dissecting every implication, calculating every possible outcome. By the time pale orange light painted the eastern sky, Sebastian had made his decision. Not the decision they expected, but the only one his conscience would allow. He rose from his bedroll with deliberate noise, making sure they knew he was awake. Through the canvas divider, he heard the immediate shift in their breathing. Both women had been awake too, waiting, preparing for whatever came next. Sebastian pushed through the curtain and found them both sitting upright. Elena looked better. The color had returned to her face, though pain still tightened the corners of her mouth. Elena stood beside the cold stove, her posture ready, defensive. Between them sat a worn leather satchel that hadn't been visible the night before. "Coffee?" Sebastian asked, his tone deliberately casual as he moved to the stove, striking a match to kindle the fire. "We should leave," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. "Dawn has come. We've honored your conditions. Sit down," Sebastian replied, not looking at her. "Both of you. We need to talk." He could feel Elena's tension from across the room, sense her hand moving closer to whatever weapon she had concealed in her clothing. These weren't helpless women seeking charity. They were warriors on a mission, and he'd just disrupted their carefully laid plans. Sebastian poured water into a battered tin pot and set it on the stove. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he measured out coffee grounds with steady hands. When he finally turned to face them, his expression was unreadable. "I heard you," he said simply. "Last night. Every word you said in Apache. I know why you're really here." Elena's face went rigid, her eyes flashing with a mix of surprise and defiance. Elena's hand moved instinctively to her wounded side, as if preparing to flee despite her injury. "You speak Diné Bizard?" Elena asked, using the proper Apache term for their language, her voice tight with controlled anger at being deceived. "Enough to understand when 2 women are plotting to blackmail me," Sebastian replied. He leaned against the rough wooden table, his arms crossed. Thomas Running Bear taught me, during our investigation before Hutchins killed him. He said if I was going to work with his people, I needed to understand them. Not just their words, their way of thinking. Elena's jaw clenched. Then you know we're not asking for your help. We're demanding it. You're threatening me, Sebastian corrected, his voice hard. There's a difference. You came here with a plan. Get me to testify willingly, or destroy what's left of my reputation, and feed me to Hutchins like a staked goat. Smart strategy, ruthless, I respect that. But you're not going to cooperate, Elena said quietly, reading the tension in his posture. Sebastian was silent for a moment, letting the coffee pot hiss and bubble on the stove. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before, the voice of the marshal he used to be. I didn't say that. Both women stared at him, confusion replacing hostility. Sebastian moved to a loose board in the floor near his cot, pried it up and pulled out a small metal box. Inside was a collection of items he'd kept hidden for 3 years, his marshal's badge, tarnished and bent, a folded letter bearing federal seals, a photograph of a younger, more hopeful man in uniform, and a small leather journal. He tossed the journal onto the table between them. I kept records, Sebastian said. Everything I saw that night. Every detail of Hutchins's operation, every corrupt officer involved, every bribe, every threat. I documented it all before I ran. I told myself I was preserving evidence for someday, for when I finally found the courage to use it. Elena picked up the journal, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Her eyes scanned the pages, detailed accounts written in Sebastian's precise handwriting, names, dates, descriptions of crimes. Her breath caught when she reached the entry dated 3 years ago, the night Thomas died. I watched them kill him, she read aloud, her voice breaking. 5 men, led by Captain Vernon Wells, under orders from Colonel Hutchins. Thomas Running Bear fought. He never begged. He died protecting documents he said would free his people. I hid in the shadows like a coward. I did nothing. God forgive me, I did nothing. The last words came out as barely a whisper. When Elena looked up, tears streaked her face. Not tears of sadness, but of rage. You wrote this, but you never used it, she said, her voice shaking. You had evidence, and you buried it along with your conscience. I know, Sebastian said, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't look away from the accusation. I was afraid. Hutchins threatened my family, my sister in Virginia, my aging mother. He showed me letters describing their daily routines, where they shopped, where they went to church. The message was clear: testify and they die. So I took his blood money and I disappeared. And now, Elena asked, studying him with those sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Now I'm telling you that your plan was flawed from the start, Sebastian continued. Blackmailing me won't work. Threatening to expose me to Hutchins won't work. You know why? Because I've been exposed every day for 3 years. I wake up every morning knowing exactly what I am. Your threats can't make me feel worse than I already do. Then we've wasted our time, Elena said bitterly, moving to help her sister stand. Come, Elena, we'll find another way. I'm not finished, Sebastian said, his voice carrying command now, the authority of a lawman surfacing. Sit down. Something in his tone made them pause. It wasn't a request. It was an order from a man who'd remembered how to give them. You came here thinking I was just another coward to be manipulated, Sebastian continued. But you were wrong about one thing. I may have run from Hutchins, but I never stopped being a marshal. I never stopped gathering evidence. I never stopped planning for the day I'd finally have the courage to face him. He pulled out a map from the metal box, spreading it across the table. It was covered in notations, routes, locations, names. For 3 years, I've been tracking Hutchins's movements. He's expanded his operation. He's not just stealing Apache lands anymore. He's working with a network of corrupt officials across 3 territories. He's trafficking stolen government supplies, running illegal mining operations, and he's got federal judges in his pocket from here to Denver. Elena's eyes widened as she studied the map. This is extensive. I've been living like a hermit, but I haven't been idle, Sebastian said. Every trip to town, every conversation with passing travelers, every newspaper I could get my hands on, I've been building a case. The problem was never the evidence. It was finding someone who had the courage and the platform to use it. He looked directly at Elena. Thomas's documents, the ones you've been carrying, they're land deeds and water rights, aren't they? Proof that Hutchins forged signatures and bribed officials. How did you know? Elena asked. Because that's what Thomas was working on when he died. He told me he was close to finishing a complete record. Sebastian's expression softened slightly. He also told me about his wife, about how she was the strongest person he knew, about how if anything happened to him, she'd be the one to carry on the fight. Elena's composure cracked. She pressed her hands flat against the table, her shoulders shaking with suppressed emotion. He said that. His last words, according to my notes, were in Apache. I didn't understand them then, but I learned the language later so I could translate them. Sebastian's voice grew quiet. He said, "Tell Elena the documents are buried where the red stones sing. Tell her she was right. The fight was worth dying for." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She sank into the chair, her hand covering her mouth. Elena moved to her sister's side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Elena whispered. "Why didn't you find me and tell me what he said?" "Because I was ashamed," Sebastian admitted. "How could I face you? How could I tell you I'd heard your husband's dying words, but had been too much of a coward to save him? So I wrote it down, preserved it, and told myself that someday, if I ever found the strength, I'd give you the justice Thomas died for." The coffee pot began to boil over, hissing and sputtering on the stove. Sebastian moved to pull it off the heat, his hands steady, despite the emotional storm in the room. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, pouring coffee into 3 tin cups. "You're going to show me Thomas's documents. I'm going to add my testimony and evidence to yours. And then we're going to take everything, all of it, and we're going to destroy Colonel Raymond Hutchins. He'll kill you the moment you surface," Elena said, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "He has men everywhere. The moment word gets out that you're alive and talking, you're a dead man." "Probably," Sebastian agreed, echoing her own words from the night before. "But I'll die doing the job I swore an oath to do. And that's a better death than drinking myself into oblivion in this shack." Elena spoke up, her voice still weak but determined. "It's not just Hutchins. He's working with others. We were attacked 3 days ago by men we'd never seen before. Professional killers, not soldiers. Someone warned them we were coming." "Hutchins has partners," Sebastian confirmed. "According to my research, he's aligned with a businessman named Garrett Stillwell. Stillwell runs freight operations across the territory, but it's a front for smuggling and money laundering. Then there's Judge Marcus Blackwood in Santa Fe. He's been dismissing cases against Hutchins for years. And finally, there's a U.S. Army quartermaster named Lieutenant Frank Morrison, who's been diverting supplies to Hutchins's illegal operations." "That's a significant conspiracy," Elena said, studying the map with new understanding. "How do we fight that?" "We don't fight them all at once," Sebastian replied. "We go after the weakest link. We expose one, and the rest will turn on each other like wolves. Criminals always do when they sense the law closing in." "Who's the weakest link?" Elena asked. Sebastian tapped a name on his map. "Lieutenant Morrison. He's a gambler deep in debt. He's also a drunk with a conscience. 6 months ago, I heard through a contact in Albuquerque that Morrison tried to confess to a chaplain but was stopped by Hutchins's men. He's the one who wants out. He's the one we can flip." Elena stood, pacing the small confines of the shack. Sebastian could see her mind working, processing this new information, recalculating her strategy. "If we can get Morrison to testify," she said slowly, "and combine it with Thomas's documents and your eyewitness account, we'd have enough to trigger a federal investigation," Sebastian finished. "One that even Hutchins's corrupt judges can't stop. So what's the plan?" Elena asked, wincing as she shifted her position. Sebastian pulled out a chair and sat down, finally allowing himself to look like the exhausted, broken man he'd been pretending to be for 3 years. First, your sister needs real medical attention. That wound is going to get infected if we don't get her to a proper doctor. Second, we need to secure the documents in a place Hutchins can't reach. Third, we need to get word to Morrison that we're offering him a deal, full confession in exchange for protection. Hutchins will never let Morrison testify, Elena objected. He'll have him killed. Not if Morrison disappears first, Sebastian countered. I know people. Good people who owe me favors from my martial days. People who can hide a man where even Hutchins can't find him. And what about us? Elena asked, gesturing to herself and Elena. We're targets now. Those men who attacked us will be hunting us. Sebastian met her eyes. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw not a coward, but a dangerous, determined man. Then we make sure they find us, he said. But on our terms, in a place of our choosing. We set a trap, and we use ourselves as bait. That's insane, Elena said. That's justice, Sebastian corrected. Hutchins thinks I'm a coward who'll never resurface. He thinks you're just a widow with no power, no connections, no way to hurt him. He's gotten comfortable in his corruption. Comfortable men make mistakes. Elena studied Sebastian for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception or weakness. What she found instead was something she hadn't expected, a man who'd been waiting 3 years for a reason to stop running. If we do this, she said carefully, if we commit to this fight, we're all dead if we fail. We're all dead anyway, Sebastian replied. The only question is whether we die as cowards or as people who stood for something. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the stove. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, burning away the last traces of the storm. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful, harsh, and unforgiving. Elena extended her hand across the table. Thomas believed in you once. Against my better judgment, I'm choosing to believe in you now. Don't make me regret it. Sebastian took her hand, feeling the strength in her grip, the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder choices. I've regretted every day of the last 3 years, he said. I'm done with regrets. From this moment forward, we fight. Elena placed her hand on top of theirs, completing the circle. For Thomas, she said softly. For Thomas, Elena echoed, her voice stronger now. For justice, Sebastian added, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt the weight of his badge, even though it sat in a box on the floor, as a promise instead of a prison. The alliance was formed. The plan was set in motion, and Sebastian Drake, the coward who'd hidden in the desert for 3 years, was about to become the most dangerous man Colonel Raymond Hutchins had ever faced, because a man with nothing left to lose and everything to atone for was the most dangerous kind of enemy, and Sebastian had just declared war. The decision to move came swiftly. Within an hour of their alliance, Sebastian had packed what little he owned into weathered saddlebags, while Elena prepared Elena for travel. The younger sister's wound had stabilized, but the journey ahead would test her endurance in ways that concerned them all. There's a settlement called Copper Ridge, Sebastian explained, as he cinched the saddle on his aging roan mare. 40 miles northeast. It's got a doctor, Benjamin Hartwell. He was a Union Army surgeon during the war, patched up more gut wounds than he can count. He doesn't ask questions, and he sure as hell doesn't report to anyone. 40 miles, Elena said, her hand pressed to her bandaged side. I can make it. Elena shot her sister a worried glance but said nothing. They both knew there wasn't a choice. Staying at Sebastian's shack meant death. Hutchins' men would eventually track them here, and when they did, the remote location that had been Sebastian's sanctuary would become their tomb. Sebastian had 2 horses, his mare and a sturdy pack mule that had seen better days. It wasn't enough for 3 riders, which meant Elena would have to share Sebastian's horse, while Elena took the mule. It was far from ideal, but the desert rarely offered ideal solutions. As they prepared to leave, Sebastian took one last look at the shack that had been his prison for 3 years. Part of him wanted to burn it down, erase this chapter of cowardice from existence. But another part, the lawman's part, knew that sometimes you had to carry your shame with you as a reminder of who you'd been and why you could never go back. "We ride north first," Sebastian said, mounting his mare and helping Elena settle behind him. "If Hutchins's men are tracking you, they'll expect you to head west toward Apache territory or south toward Mexico. Northeast takes us into terrain they won't anticipate. Canyon country. Hard riding, no water for stretches." "You're testing us," Elena said, adjusting the mule's reins. "I'm keeping us alive," Sebastian corrected. "The men hunting you aren't ordinary soldiers. You said they were professionals. That means they're trackers, probably ex-cavalry scouts who know this territory as well as I do. We can't outrun them, so we have to outsmart them." They rode out as the sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. Sebastian set a punishing pace, pushing the animals harder than he normally would. Behind him, he could feel Elena's grip tighten around his waist whenever the mare hit rough ground. Her sharp intakes of breath telling him the wound was causing. Her agony, despite her stoic silence. The landscape shifted as they traveled. Flat scrubland giving way to rocky outcroppings and eventually to the entrance of a maze-like canyon system. The red stone walls rose around them like the ribs of some ancient beast, offering shade but also concealment for anyone who might be following. "How do you know this route?" Elena asked, guiding the mule alongside Sebastian's horse during a brief flat stretch. "Mapped it 2 years ago," Sebastian replied, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines above. "When you're a wanted man living in isolation, you learn every escape route within 50 miles. These canyons connect to old Apache trails that eventually lead to Copper Ridge. Most white men don't know they exist. But you do." "Thomas showed me," Sebastian admitted. "Before he died, we spent weeks riding together, documenting Hutchins's illegal operations. He taught me how to read the land the way your people do, how to find water in dry creek beds, how to navigate by landmarks that don't appear on any map. He said if I was going to help his people, I needed to see the world through their eyes." Elena was quiet for a moment, processing this new information about her late husband. "He never told me he was working with a marshal. He was protecting you," Sebastian said. "The less you knew, the safer you were. Thomas understood that his work might get him killed. He didn't want to make you a target too. Yet here I am," Elena said with bitter irony. "A target anyway, carrying the very documents he died protecting." They pushed deeper into the canyon system, the walls narrowing until they rode single file through passages where sunlight barely penetrated. Sebastian's instincts, honed by years as a lawman, screamed that they were being watched, but he saw no one. Still, the feeling persisted, a crawling sensation between his shoulder blades that made his trigger finger itch. At midday, they stopped to rest in a sheltered alcove, where a thin stream of water trickled from a crack in the stone. Elena practically fell from the horse, her face gray with exhaustion and pain. Elena rushed to her side, helping her sit against the cool rock wall. "Let me see the wound," Sebastian said. Kneeling beside them, Elena reluctantly lifted her shirt, revealing the bandage now spotted with fresh blood. The ride had reopened part of the knife wound. Sebastian cursed under his breath, pulling fresh cloth from his saddlebag. "We need to reach Hartwell before infection sets in," he said, redressing the wound with practiced efficiency. "Another 25 miles. If we push hard, we can make it by nightfall." "She needs rest, not more riding," Elena protested. "She needs antibiotics and proper stitching," Sebastian countered. "Rest won't save her if that wound goes septic. I've seen men die from less." As if to punctuate his words, Elena's body suddenly convulsed with violent shivers despite the desert heat. Fever was setting in. "We move now," Sebastian said, his tone brooking no argument. They remounted, but they'd barely traveled another mile when Sebastian spotted something that made his blood run cold. Fresh hoof prints in the sandy floor of the canyon. Multiple horses moving fast, heading in the same direction they were traveling. "We've got company," he said quietly, pulling his mare to a halt. "Someone's ahead of us." Elena's hand moved to the rifle strapped to her saddle. "Hutchins's men?" Maybe, or could be prospectors, traders. Sebastian dismounted, studying the tracks with an expert eye. 5 horses, all shod military style, riding in formation. These aren't civilians. How far ahead? 2 hours, maybe 3. Sebastian remounted, his jaw set in a grim line. They're not tracking us, they're cutting us off. Someone figured out where we were heading. How is that possible? Elena demanded. You said no one knew about these routes. Sebastian's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Then it hit him. The traveling merchant he'd spoken to 3 weeks ago in Broken Spine. He'd mentioned needing to visit a doctor in Copper Ridge someday. It had seemed like harmless conversation at the time, but if Hutchins had informants in every settlement, I was careless, Sebastian admitted, the words tasting like ash. I talked to someone about Copper Ridge. If Hutchins' network is as extensive as I think, word could have reached him. He'd know there's only a handful of doctors in this region willing to treat fugitives. Hartwell would be on that list. So they're waiting for us, Elena said, understanding dawning in her eyes. They're setting a trap, Sebastian confirmed. And we're riding straight into it. Behind him, Elena moaned softly, her fever worsening. They couldn't turn back. She'd die without treatment. But riding forward meant walking into an ambush. There's another way, Sebastian said suddenly, pulling out his battered map. It's dangerous, but it might work. There's an old mining settlement called Devil's Fork, about 8 miles east of here. Abandoned 5 years ago when the silver ran out. There's a woman there, Maggie Thornton. She's a folk healer, knows herbs and field medicine. Not a real doctor, but she might be able to stabilize Elena long enough for us to figure out our next move. And if she can't? Elena asked. Then we risk the trap at Copper Ridge, Sebastian said bluntly. But at least this way, we're not playing into Hutchins' hands. The decision was made. They altered course, following a narrow side canyon that branched off from the main route. The terrain became increasingly treacherous, loose scree that made the horses stumble, narrow ledges where one wrong step meant a deadly fall. Elena's condition continued to deteriorate. She was no longer fully conscious, her weight slumping against Sebastian's back. He had to hook one arm behind him to keep her from sliding off the horse. "Stay with us, Shidiji," Elena called out in Apache, her voice tight with fear. "We're almost there." But they weren't there. Devil's Fork was still miles away, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Soon they'd be traveling in darkness, navigating treacherous paths by moonlight. That's when they heard it, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoing off the canyon walls. The bullet struck the rock face inches from Sebastian's head, sending stone chips flying. Instinct took over. He yanked the mare's reins hard, sending the animal scrambling behind a large boulder. Elena reacted with equal speed, driving the mule into cover. "They found us," Elena hissed, pulling her rifle free. "No," Sebastian said, his experienced ear analyzing the shot. "That wasn't military precision. That was a warning shot from someone who could have killed me, but chose not to," a voice called out from above, echoing through the canyon. "Sebastian Drake! We know who you are. Come out and talk, or the next shot goes through your horse." Sebastian recognized the voice. It belonged to Carl Weatherby, a former Army scout who'd worked with Hutchins before supposedly retiring. But Weatherby had a reputation. He was a mercenary who sold his services to the highest bidder, not a loyal soldier. "What do we do?" Elena whispered urgently. Sebastian's mind worked furiously. Weatherby was smart, dangerous, but also pragmatic. He wasn't the type to die for a cause or a paycheck. He was the type to negotiate. "Cover me," Sebastian said, slowly standing up with his hands visible. "And if this goes wrong, take Elena and run. Don't look back." "Sebastian," Elena started. "That's not a request," Sebastian said with quiet authority. "You're carrying Thomas's documents. They matter more than I do." Before she could argue, Sebastian stepped out into the open, his hands raised high. "Weatherby!" he called out. "Long time?" Still taking Hutchins' dirty money. A figure appeared on the canyon rim above, a lean man with a weathered face and a rifle aimed directly at Sebastian's chest. 2 more men flanked him, their weapons trained on the rocks where Elena hid. Nothing personal, Drake, Weatherby called down. Colonel's paying top dollar for you and those Apache women. Said you might come this way. Smart man, that colonel. Smart enough to pay you what you're worth? Sebastian countered, buying time. Or just smart enough to use you until you're not useful anymore? Weatherby's expression flickered, a brief moment of uncertainty. You always did talk too much, Marshal. And you always did sell yourself cheap, Sebastian shot back. How much is Hutchins paying you? 500? 1,000? Because I can offer you something better, your life. I'm not the one with 3 guns pointed at his head, Weatherby observed. No, but you're the one working for a man whose empire is about to collapse, Sebastian said, his voice carrying confidence he didn't entirely feel. We've got evidence, Weatherby. Documents, testimony, a complete record of Hutchins's crimes. The federal government is going to come down on him like the wrath of God. And when they do, everyone associated with him is going to hang right alongside him. You're bluffing, Weatherby said, but his rifle had lowered slightly. Thomas Running Bear's land documents, Sebastian continued. My eyewitness testimony to murder. And we're about to flip Lieutenant Morrison. He's ready to confess everything. You've been in the game long enough to know what that means. Hutchins is finished. The only question is whether you go down with him or whether you walk away clean. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sebastian could see Weatherby's men exchanging glances, doubt creeping into their postures. What are you offering? Weatherby finally asked. Let us pass, Sebastian said. Forget you saw us. When the federal investigation comes, and it will, you were never here, you never worked for Hutchins. You're just another retired scout trying to make an honest living. And if I don't? Then you can collect Hutchins' bounty, Sebastian said coldly. But you'll have to kill all 3 of us to do it. And the woman behind that rock, she's Apache. She knows this territory better than you ever will. You might get me, but she'll disappear into these canyons, and those documents will end up in federal hands anyway. Plus, you'll have murdered a federal marshal, even a disgraced one. That's a hanging offense, and no amount of Hutchins' money will save you. Weatherby was silent for a long moment, his sharp eyes calculating odds and outcomes. Finally, he lowered his rifle completely. You always were a silver-tongued bastard, Drake, he said with grudging respect. All right, I'm out. This job's getting too complicated for my taste. He looked at his men. We're leaving. Does anyone have a problem with that? The 2 men quickly shook their heads. They were hired guns, not fanatics. Without Weatherby's leadership, they weren't interested in a fight. One more thing, Sebastian called out as they began to leave. Tell Hutchins you tracked us to the Sangre Canyon and lost our trail. Send him chasing ghosts while we finish what we started. Weatherby actually smiled at that. You got guts, Marshal. Always did. Hope you live long enough to use that evidence. Then he and his men disappeared over the canyon rim, the sound of their horses fading into the distance. Sebastian stood perfectly still until he was certain they were gone. Then his legs nearly gave out from the adrenaline crash. Elena emerged from cover, her rifle still raised, her eyes wide with disbelief. You just talked down 3 armed men with nothing but words, she said. Weatherby's a businessman, not a believer, Sebastian replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. He knows when to cut his losses. But we're not safe yet. He bought us time, nothing more. We need to reach Maggie Thornton before Hutchins sends someone who can't be talked out of killing us. They remounted quickly, Elena now completely unconscious and burning with fever. The race was on, not just against Hutchins' men, but against time itself. Every minute counted, every mile could be Elena's last. As the sun set and the desert cooled, Sebastian pushed them harder than ever, following paths only he and the dead Thomas Running Bear had known existed. Behind them, somewhere in the vast expanse of the New Mexico territory, Colonel Raymond Hutchins was mobilizing his forces. The hunt had begun in earnest, and Sebastian Drake, the coward-turned-warrior, was leading 2 Apache sisters through hell itself to reach salvation. The question wasn't whether they'd make it to Devil's Fork. The question was what would be waiting for them when they arrived. Devil's Fork appeared like a ghost town, carved from disappointment and abandoned dreams. The settlement clung to the side of a barren hillside, its buildings weathered grey by wind and sun, their windows like empty eye sockets staring into nothing. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered across the landscape like the bones of some mechanical beast, and the old smelter chimney stood as a lonely monument to failed ambitions. Sebastian guided his exhausted mare through the main street, if it could even be called that, as full darkness descended. Elena was completely limp against his back, her breathing shallow and rapid. They'd pushed the horses beyond their limits, and now both animals stumbled with fatigue. "Are you certain someone still lives here?" Elena asked, her voice hoarse from dust and worry. The ghost town seemed utterly deserted, not a single light visible in any window. "Maggie's here," Sebastian said with more confidence than he felt. "She doesn't advertise her presence, but she never leaves. This place is her penance. Penance for what?" Before Sebastian could answer, a voice cut through the darkness, strong, female, and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone holding a weapon. "That's close enough, whoever you are. State your business or turn around." A lamp flickered to life in the doorway of what had once been the town's general store. The light revealed a woman in her 50s, broad-shouldered and sturdy, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She held a double-barreled shotgun with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. "Maggie Thornton," Sebastian called out, carefully keeping his hands visible. "It's Sebastian Drake. I've got a wounded woman who needs help. Knife wound, fever setting in. We've got nowhere else to go." The shotgun didn't lower. "Sebastian Drake died 3 years ago, according to most accounts, or turned into a desert hermit, according to others. Either way, he stopped being my concern. I know we didn't part on good terms," Sebastian said, and Elena caught the edge of old pain in his voice. "But this isn't about me. It's about a woman who'll die without treatment. You took an oath once, Maggie. I'm asking you to honor it." Maggie stepped closer, the lamplight revealing a weathered face marked by hard years and harder choices. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, moved from Sebastian to Elena, then to Elena's unconscious form. "Apache women," she observed. "That one's burning up with fever. I can see it from here." She studied Sebastian for a long moment, some internal debate playing across her features. Finally, she lowered the shotgun. "Get her inside. But Drake, you and I are going to have words once she's stabilized." They carried Elena into what had been converted into a makeshift infirmary. The space was surprisingly well equipped. A sturdy examination table, cabinets filled with glass bottles of herbs and tinctures, surgical instruments that gleamed clean in the lamplight. This wasn't the hovel of a desperate hermit. This was the workshop of a skilled healer who'd simply chosen isolation. Maggie worked with swift, practiced efficiency, cutting away Elena's bloodied bandages and examining the wound with a critical eye. "Knife wound, you said? This was meant to kill. Went deep. Nicked something important. She's lucky to be alive. Can you save her?" Elena asked, hovering close, her hand gripping her sister's. "Maybe," Maggie said bluntly. "Depends on how much fight she's got left in her. Infections set in, but not so deep I can't combat it. She'll need willow bark for the fever, yarrow and golden seal for the infection, and fresh stitching where this butcher job came apart." She glanced at Sebastian. "Your work?" "Emergency field dressing," Sebastian admitted. "It was all I could do. Well, it kept her alive this long. I'll give you that." Maggie turned to Elena. "You're her sister." "Yes, Elena, and this is Elena." "Apache?" "Yes." Maggie nodded, no judgment in her expression. "I've treated Apache, Navajo, Hopi, doesn't matter to me. Flesh is flesh, blood is blood. Now I need you to help hold her down. This is going to hurt, and even unconscious, her body's going to fight me." What followed was an hour of intense, grueling medical work. Maggie cleaned the wound with solutions that made even the unconscious Elena cry out. She applied poultices made from herbs, whose names Elena didn't recognize, then stitched the wound closed with tiny, precise sutures that spoke of years of experience. Throughout it all, Sebastian stood near the doorway, watching but not interfering. Elena noticed how Maggie never looked at him directly, how a tension existed between them that went beyond the usual awkwardness of reunion. Finally, with Elena bandaged, medicated, and sleeping peacefully on a clean cot, Maggie washed her hands in a basin and turned to face Sebastian fully for the first time. Kitchen, now. You owe me an explanation. The kitchen was a small, orderly space attached to the infirmary. Maggie poured 3 cups of strong coffee and gestured for them to sit at a scarred wooden table. The silence was heavy with unspoken history. 3 years, Maggie finally said, her voice controlled but carrying an undercurrent of anger. 3 years, Sebastian. You disappeared without a word. No letter, no message, nothing. I thought you were dead. I needed you to think that, Sebastian said quietly. Everyone needed to think that. Why? Maggie demanded. We were... She stopped, glancing at Elena, then back to Sebastian. We were supposed to be partners. In the practice, in the work, in everything. Then you vanished the same week that Marshall's scandal happened in Widow's Creek. I heard the rumors, that you'd taken bribes, that you'd let a man die, that you'd run like a coward. I didn't want to believe it. You should have believed it, Sebastian said, his voice flat. Because it was all true. The admission hung in the air like a confession in church. Maggie's hands tightened around her coffee cup, her knuckles white. So you were a coward, she said. And rather than face it, rather than come to me for help, you just ran. You'd let me think you were dead or worse. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I know, Sebastian said, and the pain in his voice was raw. I know exactly what it did because it's what I've been doing to myself for 3 years. Maggie, I didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness. I came because this woman, he gestured to where Elena lay sleeping, is dying because of the same man who destroyed me. Colonel Hutchins, and her sister is trying to finish what her husband started, bringing Hutchins to justice. Maggie's eyes sharpened. Thomas Running Bear, I heard about his death. They said it was a drunken fight. They lied, Elena interjected, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the kitchen. It was murder. Colonel Hutchins ordered it because my husband had evidence of his crimes. Sebastian was there. He saw it happen. Maggie looked between them, understanding slowly dawning. And you did nothing to stop it. I was outnumbered, unarmed, and terrified, Sebastian said. So I hid and I watched a good man die. Then Hutchins bought my silence with gold and threats against my family. I took the money and I ran. He met Maggie's gaze directly. I ran from Hutchins, from my badge, from you, from everything that reminded me I was supposed to be better than that. But you kept records, Maggie said slowly. You always kept records. That was your obsession, documenting everything. I documented all of it, Sebastian confirmed. Every crime, every name, every detail. I told myself I was preserving evidence for some future day when I'd find the courage to use it. But days turned into months, months into years, and the courage never came. Until these 2 women showed up at my shack and forced me to face what I'd become. Elena spoke up, her voice firm. Sebastian has agreed to testify against Hutchins. We have my husband's documents proving land fraud and corruption. Combined with Sebastian's eyewitness testimony and the evidence he's gathered, we can destroy Hutchins's operation. You'll be killed, Maggie said bluntly. Hutchins has the entire territory in his pocket. Judges, soldiers, businessmen, they're all feeding from his trough. Not all of them, Sebastian countered. There are weak links, men who want out but are too afraid to act. We're going to flip them, one by one, until Hutchins's empire collapses from within. Maggie was silent for a long moment, studying Sebastian with those sharp, assessing eyes that had always seen through his defenses. Finally she spoke. You're serious about this? You're actually going to stand up and fight? I'm going to try, Sebastian said. And if I die doing it, at least I'll die as something other than a coward. That's noble, Maggie said, her tone dry. Also stupid. Also probably suicidal. She paused, then sighed deeply. Also, the first thing you've said in 3 years that sounds like the man I used to know. She stood, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. From it she pulled out a familiar leather satchel, the kind doctors carried. But when she opened it, instead of medical supplies, it contained papers, letters, and documents. After you disappeared, I did some investigating of my own, Maggie explained. I couldn't believe you'd just turned coward without a reason. So I started asking questions, following leads, talking to people who'd worked with you. And I found things. She spread several documents on the table. Letters between Colonel Hutchins and Judge Blackwood discussing bribes. Shipping manifest showing stolen government supplies being diverted to Hutchins's operations. Witness statements from Apache and Navajo families whose land was stolen. Sebastian stared at the documents in amazement. "You've been building a case against Hutchins." "I've been trying to understand what happened to you," Maggie corrected. "The case against Hutchins was a byproduct. I figured if I could prove he was behind the corruption, I could prove you weren't just a simple coward. You were a man caught in an impossible situation." "Why?" Sebastian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do that for me after I abandoned you?" Maggie's expression softened slightly. "Because despite everything, I still believed the man I knew was in there somewhere. Looks like I was right." She looked at Elena. "Your husband's documents, combined with my evidence and Sebastian's testimony, we might actually have enough to take Hutchins down." Elena's eyes widened. "You'll help us?" "I'll do better than that," Maggie said. "I'll come with you. Someone needs to keep you idiots alive long enough to testify, and I'm the only one here with sense." She looked at Sebastian with a mix of exasperation and something that might have been affection. "Besides, you owe me 3 years of explanations, and I'm not letting you get killed before I collect." Sebastian felt something loosen in his chest. A knot of guilt and shame he'd been carrying for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. "Maggie, if you do this, you become a target too." "I became a target the moment I started investigating Hutchins," Maggie replied. "Why do you think I'm living in an abandoned mining town with a shotgun by my door?" "I've been hiding too, Sebastian, just in a different way." She extended her hand across the table. "So what do you say? Want to stop hiding and start fighting?" Sebastian took her hand, feeling the strength and surety in her grip. "I'd be honored." Elena placed her hand on top of theirs. "For Thomas. For justice. For all the people Hutchins has destroyed. For redemption," Maggie added quietly. Looking at Sebastian, they sat there for a moment. 3 unlikely allies bound by shared purpose and the understanding that the path ahead would likely end in blood. But it was a path chosen freely, walked willingly, and that made all the difference. Outside, the night was deep and still, the kind of desert darkness that swallowed sound and kept secrets. Somewhere out there, Colonel Hutchins was marshalling his forces, sending his hunters to track down the women who threatened his empire, and the disgraced marshal who'd finally found his spine. But in Devil's Fork, in the ghost town that refused to die, a different kind of force was gathering. Not an army, not a militia, but something perhaps more dangerous. People who'd lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. Elena stirred in the other room, her fever beginning to break. She would survive the night, and with survival came the chance to see her sister's mission through to its end. Sebastian stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. Somewhere in his memory, he heard Thomas Running Bear's voice, teaching him to read the desert, to understand that even in the harshest landscape, life found a way to persist. "We're going to need a plan," he said, turning back to the 2 women. "Hutchins won't expect us to come at him directly. He thinks we're running, hiding, trying to survive. So we do the opposite. We attack." "Attack how?" Elena asked. "We're 3 people against an empire." "4," came a weak voice from the doorway. Elena stood there, pale and swaying but conscious, one hand pressed to her bandaged side. 4 people. And I didn't survive a knife wound and a fever just to sit on the sidelines." Maggie immediately moved to support her. "You should be resting." "I've rested enough," Elena said with quiet determination. "My sister and my brother-in-law fought for justice. Now it's my turn. Tell me the plan." Sebastian looked at these 3 remarkable women, a widow seeking justice for her murdered husband, a sister willing to die for that cause, and a healer who'd been building a case against corruption while living in self-imposed exile. They were damaged, desperate, and dangerous. They were exactly what he needed. "The plan," Sebastian said, spreading out maps and documents on the table, "is to make Hutchins come to us. We're going to force his hand, expose his crimes in a way he can't hide from, and we're going to do it in a place where the whole territory can see. We're going to give him a choice, surrender to justice or burn his empire to the ground trying to stop us. Where? Maggie asked. Sebastian pointed to a spot on the map, the territorial capital of Santa Fe, right in front of Governor Wallace himself, at the territorial courthouse. In 3 days, there's a public assembly where citizens can bring grievances before the territorial government. We're going to present our evidence there, in front of witnesses, reporters, and officials Hutchins doesn't control. He'll have you killed before you reach the podium, Elena said. Probably, Sebastian agreed, unless we make it impossible for him to act without exposing himself. We need leverage, insurance, something that guarantees if we die, the truth comes out anyway. I know someone, Maggie said slowly. A newspaper editor in Albuquerque, Harrison Cole. He hates Hutchins, lost his brother to one of the colonel's land grabs. If we give him copies of everything, all the documents, all the testimony, with instructions to publish if we don't check in, then Hutchins can't silence us without condemning himself, Sebastian finished. It's not perfect, but it's a start. They worked through the night, planning, preparing, copying documents by lamplight. By dawn, they had the outline of a strategy that was equal parts brilliant and suicidal, but it was a strategy. A path forward. A chance, however slim, to turn 3 years of cowardice and grief into something that mattered. As the sun rose over Devil's Fork, painting the ghost town in shades of gold and red, Sebastian Drake stood with 3 women who'd become his unlikely army. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy who controlled an empire, but they had something Hutchins didn't, the absolute certainty that came from having nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. The war was about to begin, and this time Sebastian Drake wasn't running. Devil's Fork appeared like a ghost town, carved from disappointment and abandoned dreams. The settlement clung to the side of a barren hillside, its buildings weathered grey by wind and sun, their windows like empty eye sockets staring into nothing. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered across the landscape like the bones of some mechanical beast, and the old smelter chimney stood as a lonely monument to failed ambitions. Sebastian guided his exhausted mare through the main street, if it could even be called that, as full darkness descended. Elena was completely limp against his back, her breathing shallow and rapid. They'd pushed the horses beyond their limits, and now both animals stumbled with fatigue. "Are you certain someone still lives here?" Elena asked, her voice hoarse from dust and worry. The ghost town seemed utterly deserted, not a single light visible in any window. "Maggie's here," Sebastian said with more confidence than he felt. "She doesn't advertise her presence, but she never leaves. This place is her penance. Penance for what?" Before Sebastian could answer, a voice cut through the darkness, strong, female, and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone holding a weapon. "That's close enough, whoever you are. State your business or turn around." A lamp flickered to life in the doorway of what had once been the town's general store. The light revealed a woman in her 50s, broad-shouldered and sturdy, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. She held a double-barreled shotgun with the easy familiarity of someone who knew how to use it. "Maggie Thornton," Sebastian called out, carefully keeping his hands visible. "It's Sebastian Drake. I've got a wounded woman who needs help. Knife wound, fever setting in. We've got nowhere else to go." The shotgun didn't lower. "Sebastian Drake died 3 years ago, according to most accounts, or turned into a desert hermit, according to others. Either way, he stopped being my concern. I know we didn't part on good terms," Sebastian said, and Elena caught the edge of old pain in his voice. "But this isn't about me. It's about a woman who'll die without treatment. You took an oath once, Maggie. I'm asking you to honor it." Maggie stepped closer, the lamplight revealing a weathered face marked by hard years and harder choices. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, moved from Sebastian to Elena, then to Elena's unconscious form. "Apache women," she observed. That one's burning up with fever. I can see it from here. She studied Sebastian for a long moment, some internal debate playing across her features. Finally, she lowered the shotgun. Get her inside. But Drake, you and I are going to have words once she's stabilized. They carried Elena into what had been converted into a makeshift infirmary. The space was surprisingly well equipped. A sturdy examination table, cabinets filled with glass bottles of herbs and tinctures, surgical instruments that gleamed clean in the lamplight. This wasn't the hovel of a desperate hermit. This was the workshop of a skilled healer who'd simply chosen isolation. Maggie worked with swift, practiced efficiency, cutting away Elena's bloodied bandages and examining the wound with a critical eye. Knife wound, you said. This was meant to kill. Went deep, nicked something important. She's lucky to be alive. Can you save her? Elena asked, hovering close, her hand gripping her sister's. Maybe, Maggie said bluntly. Depends on how much fight she's got left in her. Infections set in, but not so deep I can't combat it. She'll need willow bark for the fever, yarrow and golden seal for the infection, and fresh stitching where this butcher job came apart. She glanced at Sebastian. Your work? Emergency field dressing, Sebastian admitted. It was all I could do. Well, it kept her alive this long. I'll give you that. Maggie turned to Elena. You're her sister. Yes, Elena, and this is Elena. Apache. Yes, Maggie nodded, no judgment in her expression. I've treated Apache, Navajo, Hopi, doesn't matter to me. Flesh is flesh, blood is blood. Now I need you to help hold her down. This is going to hurt, and even unconscious, her body's going to fight me. What followed was an hour of intense, grueling medical work. Maggie cleaned the wound with solutions that made even the unconscious Elena cry out. She applied poultices made from herbs whose names Elena didn't recognize, then stitched the wound closed with tiny, precise sutures that spoke of years of experience. Throughout it all, Sebastian stood near the doorway, watching but not interfering. Elena noticed how Maggie never looked at him directly, how a tension existed between them that went beyond the usual awkwardness of reunion. Finally, with Elena bandaged, medicated, and sleeping peacefully on a clean cot, Maggie washed her hands in a basin and turned to face Sebastian fully for the first time. Kitchen, now, you owe me an explanation. The kitchen was a small, orderly space attached to the infirmary. Maggie poured 3 cups of strong coffee and gestured for them to sit at a scarred wooden table. The silence was heavy with unspoken history. 3 years, Maggie finally said, her voice controlled but carrying an undercurrent of anger. 3 years, Sebastian. You disappeared without a word. No letter, no message, nothing. I thought you were dead. I needed you to think that, Sebastian said quietly. Everyone needed to think that. Why? Maggie demanded. We were... She stopped, glancing at Elena, then back to Sebastian. We were supposed to be partners. In the practice, in the work, in everything. Then you vanished the same week that Marshall's scandal happened in Widow's Creek. I heard the rumors that you'd taken bribes, that you'd let a man die, that you'd run like a coward. I didn't want to believe it. You should have believed it, Sebastian said, his voice flat. Because it was all true. The admission hung in the air like a confession in church. Maggie's hands tightened around her coffee cup, her knuckles white. So you were a coward, she said. And rather than face it, rather than come to me for help, you just ran. You let me think you were dead or worse. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I know, Sebastian said, and the pain in his voice was raw. I know exactly what it did, because it's what I've been doing to myself for 3 years. Maggie, I didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness. I came because this woman, he gestured to where Elena lay sleeping, is dying because of the same man who destroyed me, Colonel Hutchins. And her sister is trying to finish what her husband started, bringing Hutchins to justice. Maggie's eyes sharpened. Thomas Running Bear, I heard about his death. They said it was a drunken fight. They lied, Elena interjected, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the kitchen. It was murder. Colonel Hutchins ordered it because my husband had evidence of his crimes. Sebastian was there. He saw it happen. Maggie looked between them, understanding slowly dawning. And you did nothing to stop it. I was outnumbered, unarmed, and terrified, Sebastian said. So I hid and I watched a good man die. Then Hutchins bought my silence with gold and threats against my family. I took the money and I ran. He met Maggie's gaze directly. I ran from Hutchins, from my badge, from you, from everything that reminded me I was supposed to be better than that. But you kept records, Maggie said slowly. You always kept records. That was your obsession, documenting everything. I documented all of it, Sebastian confirmed. Every crime, every name, every detail. I told myself I was preserving evidence for some future day when I'd find the courage to use it. But days turned into months, months into years, and the courage never came, until these two women showed up at my shack and forced me to face what I'd become. Elena spoke up, her voice firm. Sebastian has agreed to testify against Hutchins. We have my husband's documents proving land fraud and corruption. Combined with Sebastian's eyewitness testimony and the evidence he's gathered, we can destroy Hutchins's operation. You'll be killed, Maggie said bluntly. Hutchins has the entire territory in his pocket. Judges, soldiers, businessmen, they're all feeding from his trough. Not all of them, Sebastian countered. There are weak links, men who want out but are too afraid to act. We're going to flip them, one by one, until Hutchins's empire collapses from within. Maggie was silent for a long moment, studying Sebastian with those sharp, assessing eyes that had always seen through his defenses. Finally she spoke. You're serious about this? You're actually going to stand up and fight? I'm going to try, Sebastian said. And if I die doing it, at least I'll die as something other than a coward. That's noble, Maggie said, her tone dry. Also stupid, also probably suicidal. She paused, then sighed deeply. Also the first thing you've said in 3 years that sounds like the man I used to know. She stood, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. From it she pulled out a familiar leather satchel, the kind doctors carried. But when she opened it, instead of medical supplies, it contained papers, letters, and documents. After you disappeared, I did some investigating of my own, Maggie explained. I couldn't believe you'd just turned coward without a reason. So I started asking questions, following leads, talking to people who'd worked with you. And I found things. She spread several documents on the table. Letters between Colonel Hutchins and Judge Blackwood, discussing bribes, shipping manifests showing stolen government supplies being diverted to Hutchins's operations. Witness statements from Apache and Navajo families whose land was stolen. Sebastian stared at the documents in amazement. You've been building a case against Hutchins. I've been trying to understand what happened to you, Maggie corrected. The case against Hutchins was a byproduct. I figured if I could prove he was behind the corruption, I could prove you weren't just a simple coward. You were a man caught in an impossible situation. Why? Sebastian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do that for me after I abandoned you? Maggie's expression softened slightly. Because despite everything, I still believed the man I knew was in there somewhere. Looks like I was right. She looked at Elena. Your husband's documents combined with my evidence and Sebastian's testimony. We might actually have enough to take Hutchins down. Elena's eyes widened. You'll help us? I'll do better than that, Maggie said. I'll come with you. Someone needs to keep you idiots alive long enough to testify, and I'm the only one here with sense. She looked at Sebastian with a mix of exasperation and something that might have been affection. Besides, you owe me 3 years of explanations, and I'm not letting you get killed before I collect. Sebastian felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of guilt and shame he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it. Maggie, if you do this, you become a target too. I became a target the moment I started investigating Hutchins, Maggie replied. Why do you think I'm living in an abandoned mining town with a shotgun by my door? I've been hiding too, Sebastian, just in a different way. She extended her hand across the table. So what do you say? Want to stop hiding and start fighting? Sebastian took her hand, feeling the strength and surety in her grip. I'd be honored. Elena placed her hand on top of theirs. For Thomas, for justice, for all the people Hutchins has destroyed, For redemption, Maggie added quietly, looking at Sebastian. They sat there for a moment, three unlikely allies, bound by shared purpose, and the understanding that the path ahead would likely end in blood. But it was a path chosen freely, walked willingly, and that made all the difference. Outside, the night was deep and still, the kind of desert darkness that swallowed sound and kept secrets. Somewhere out there, Colonel Hutchins was marshalling his forces, sending his hunters to track down the women who threatened his empire and the disgraced marshal who'd finally found his spine. But in Devil's Fork, in a ghost town that refused to die, a different kind of force was gathering. Not an army, not a militia, but something perhaps more dangerous, people who'd lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. Elena stirred in the other room, her fever beginning to break. She would survive the night, and with survival came the chance to see her sister's mission through to its end. Sebastian stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. Somewhere in his memory, he heard Thomas Running Bear's voice, teaching him to read the desert, to understand that even in the harshest landscape, life found a way to persist. "We're going to need a plan," he said, turning back to the two women. "Hutchins won't expect us to come at him directly. He thinks we're running, hiding, trying to survive. So we do the opposite. We attack. Attack how?" Elena asked. "We're 3 people against an empire." "4," came a weak voice from the doorway. Elena stood there, pale and swaying, but conscious, one hand pressed to her bandaged side. 4 people. And I didn't survive a knife wound and a fever just to sit on the sidelines." Maggie immediately moved to support her. "You should be resting." "I've rested enough," Elena said with quiet determination. "My sister and my brother-in-law fought for justice. Now it's my turn. Tell me the plan." Sebastian looked at these 3 remarkable women, a widow seeking justice for her murdered husband, a sister willing to die for that cause, and a healer who'd been building a case against corruption while living in self-imposed exile. They were damaged, desperate, and dangerous. They were exactly what he needed. "The plan," Sebastian said, spreading out maps and documents on the table, "is to make Hutchins come to us. We're going to force his hand, expose his crimes in a way he can't hide from, and we're going to do it in a place where the whole territory can see. We're going to give him a choice, surrender to justice or burn his empire to the ground, trying to stop us." "Where?" Maggie asked. Sebastian pointed to a spot on the map, the territorial capital of Santa Fe. "Right in front of Governor Wallace himself, at the territorial courthouse. In 3 days, there's a public assembly where citizens can bring grievances before the territorial government. We're going to present our evidence there, in front of witnesses, reporters, and officials Hutchins doesn't control. He'll have you killed before you reach the podium," Elena said. "Probably," Sebastian agreed, "unless we make it impossible for him to act without exposing himself. We need leverage, insurance, something that guarantees if we die, the truth comes out anyway." "I know someone," Maggie said slowly. "A newspaper editor in Albuquerque, Harrison Cole. He hates Hutchins, lost his brother to one of the colonel's land grabs. If we give him copies of everything, all the documents, all the testimony, with instructions to publish if we don't check in, then Hutchins can't silence us without condemning himself," Sebastian finished. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." They worked through the night, planning, preparing, copying documents by lamplight. By dawn, they had the outline of a strategy that was equal parts brilliant and suicidal. But it was a strategy, a path forward, a chance, however slim, to turn 3 years of cowardice and grief into something that mattered. As the sun rose over Devil's Fork, painting the ghost town in shades of gold and red, Sebastian Drake stood with 3 women who'd become his unlikely army. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy who controlled an empire. But they had something Hutchins didn't, the absolute certainty that came from having nothing left to lose and everything left to fight for. The war was about to begin, and this time Sebastian Drake wasn't running. The journey to Santa Fe took 2 days of hard riding through terrain that shifted from desert canyon to pine-covered mountains. They traveled mostly at night, using paths that avoided the main roads and the watchful eyes of Hutchins's informants. Harrison Cole, the newspaper editor in Albuquerque, had received their package of copied documents with instructions that were brutally clear. If they didn't send word within 4 days, publish everything. Now, as dawn broke over Santa Fe on the 3rd day, the 4 of them sat in a boarding house room overlooking the plaza, watching the territorial courthouse come alive with morning activity. The public assembly was scheduled for 10 o'clock, just 3 hours away. There, Maggie said, pointing to a group of men taking positions around the courthouse steps. Hutchins's men. I count at least 8, probably more inside. Sebastian studied them through a pair of field glasses. Hard-faced men, trying to look like ordinary citizens, but their positioning was too precise, their attention too focused. These were soldiers playing at being civilians. Hutchins is here, he said. He wouldn't send this many men unless he was close enough to give direct orders. Good, Elena said, checking her husband's documents one more time, ensuring every page was in order. Let him see us walk into that courthouse. Let him watch us destroy everything he's built. Elena, still pale but determined, was binding extra bandages around her torso for support. The wound had healed enough for travel, but still caused her considerable pain. What happens when we present the evidence? Won't his men just storm the courthouse? They might, Sebastian admitted. But storming a territorial courthouse during a public assembly with reporters present would be an act of open violence against the government. Even Hutchins's corrupt judges couldn't protect him from that. No, he'll try something subtler first. Legal challenges, procedural delays, character assassination. And if that doesn't work, Maggie asked, then we'll find out just how desperate he is, Sebastian said grimly. At 9:30 they left the boarding house and walked toward the plaza. Sebastian wore his cleaned and pressed coat over a white shirt, looking every bit the respectable former marshal. Maggie had dressed in a professional dark dress that marked her as an educated woman of medicine. Elena wore a combination of traditional Apache clothing and practical Western attire, a deliberate statement that they were proud of their heritage and unafraid to stand in white man's courts. As they crossed the plaza, Sebastian felt the weight of hostile eyes tracking their movement. Hutchins's men had spotted them. Somewhere nearby, the colonel himself was watching, calculating, deciding whether to strike or wait. The courthouse steps were crowded with citizens who'd come to present grievances or simply watch the proceedings. Sebastian recognized several faces from his marshal days: merchants, ranchers, territorial officials. Some looked at him with recognition and confusion. Others simply saw a stranger. They were halfway up the steps when a voice called out, smooth and cultured, carrying the false warmth of a politician. Why, if it isn't Sebastian Drake. I thought you were dead, Marshal. Or should I say, former Marshal. Colonel Raymond Hutchins stood at the top of the steps, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits, lawyers clearly. Hutchins was in his late 50s, distinguished-looking with silver hair and a carefully groomed beard. He wore the uniform of a cavalry colonel, decorated with medals and insignia that proclaimed his status and power. His smile was practiced, but his eyes were cold as winter stone. Colonel Hutchins, Sebastian replied evenly, refusing to show any reaction. Still stealing land from people who can't fight back? Hutchins's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. Still making baseless accusations, I see. Some things never change. Though I must say, your choice of companions has become quite eclectic. His gaze moved dismissively over Elena, bringing savages to a civilized courthouse. How progressive of you! Elena stepped forward, her voice carrying across the steps with crystalline clarity. My name is Elena Running Bear. My husband, Thomas, was murdered by your men 3 years ago because he discovered proof of your crimes. Today, we're here to present that evidence to Governor Wallace and the Territorial Assembly. A murmur ran through the crowd. Reporters who'd been lounging nearby suddenly became alert, pencils appearing in hands, notebooks opening. Hutchins's expression flickered just for a moment, revealing the predator beneath the polished exterior. "How unfortunate that you believe such fantasies. Your husband's death was a tragic accident, thoroughly investigated and resolved. To suggest otherwise is not only slanderous, but potentially criminal." He nodded to one of his lawyers. "Mr. Patterson here represents my interests. He's prepared to file charges of defamation if you persist in these delusions." "Then file them," Sebastian said, his voice carrying the authority of a lawman. "But first, let these people hear the evidence. Let Governor Wallace examine the documents. Let the Territorial Assembly decide whether we're telling the truth or spreading lies. Unless you're afraid of what an honest investigation might reveal." The challenge hung in the air. Hutchins couldn't refuse without appearing guilty, but allowing them to present evidence meant losing control of the narrative. Sebastian could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes, weighing options, considering alternatives, searching for an angle. "Very well," Hutchins said finally, his smile returning. "Let's hear these accusations. I'm certain the Assembly will find them as baseless as I do. After all, I have nothing to hide." They entered the courthouse together, accusers and accused, surrounded by a growing crowd of curious onlookers and increasingly interested reporters. The Assembly Hall was a grand room with high ceilings and polished wooden benches. At the front sat Governor Lew Wallace, a distinguished man with a scholarly bearing, flanked by territorial officials and court officers. Governor Wallace looked up as they entered, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to sharp interest when he saw Hutchins personally attending the proceedings. "Colonel Hutchins," Wallace said with careful neutrality, "this is unexpected. You rarely attend public assemblies." "I felt my presence was necessary, Governor," Hutchins replied smoothly. "There are serious accusations being made by these individuals. I wanted to address them directly and demonstrate my commitment to transparency." Wallace's eyes moved to Sebastian, studying him with the keen intelligence of a man who'd served as a Union general before becoming governor. "And you are?" "Sebastian Drake, sir, former U.S. Marshal. I'm here with Mrs. Alina Running Bear and her sister Elena to present evidence of systematic corruption, land theft, and murder committed by Colonel Hutchins and his associates." The room erupted in whispers. Wallace raised a hand for silence. "Those are extraordinary accusations, Mr. Drake. I assume you have extraordinary evidence." "We do, Governor." Sebastian placed Thomas Running Bear's leather portfolio on the table before Wallace, followed by his own journals and the documents Maggie had collected. Land deeds signed under duress, financial records showing bribes to federal officials, shipping manifests documenting stolen government supplies, and eyewitness testimony to the murder of Thomas Running Bear. Wallace opened the first document, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the rustle of paper and the scratch of reporters' pencils racing across notebooks. Hutchins's lawyer, Patterson, stepped forward.
"Governor Wallace, I must object."
"These documents are clearly forgeries. Colonel Hutchins is a respected military officer with decades of honorable service. This is nothing more than a conspiracy by disgraced individuals seeking to—" "Mr. Patterson," Wallace interrupted, his tone sharp. "I can read perfectly well, and unless you're suggesting that I'm incapable of recognizing authentic federal documents when I see them, I suggest you remain silent while I examine this evidence." Patterson retreated, his face flushed. Hutchins remained perfectly composed, but Sebastian noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his hand moved subtly toward his side, where a concealed weapon likely rested. Wallace spent 15 minutes reviewing the documents, occasionally asking pointed questions that Elena answered with precise detail. When he finally looked up, his expression was troubled. "Mrs. Running Bear, these documents, if authentic, represent a pattern of corruption that extends far beyond simple land fraud. You're alleging a conspiracy involving military officers, federal judges, and territorial officials." "Yes, Governor," Elena said firmly. "My husband died documenting these crimes. Sebastian Drake witnessed his murder. And we have additional testimony from sources willing to corroborate everything. What sources? Wallace asked. This was the crucial moment. Sebastian took a breath and spoke clearly. Lieutenant Frank Morrison, U.S. Army Quartermaster. He's prepared to testify about his role in diverting military supplies to Colonel Hutchins's illegal operations. He's currently in protective custody, waiting to provide sworn testimony to federal investigators. It was a calculated bluff. Morrison hadn't actually agreed to testify yet. They hadn't even contacted him. But the claim would force Hutchins to either deny Morrison's involvement, thus making Morrison safe to actually approach, or confirm it, thus validating their entire case. Hutchins's composure finally cracked. "That's a lie!" Morrison is a loyal officer who... He stopped abruptly, realizing his mistake. By responding so strongly to Morrison's name, he'd revealed that the lieutenant was indeed connected to his operations. Governor Wallace's eyes narrowed. "Colonel, perhaps you should seek counsel before speaking further." But Hutchins was beyond caution now. His empire was crumbling, and he could feel it. "This is a conspiracy!" he roared, his cultured facade shattering. "Drake is a disgraced coward who took bribes and ran. These Apache women are liars, trying to gain sympathy. Governor Wallace, I demand you arrest these individuals for slander and attempting to defraud the territorial government." "You're in no position to demand anything, Colonel," Wallace said coldly. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm ordering a full federal investigation into your activities. You will surrender your command immediately and remain available for questioning." "I will not," Hutchins snarled. He turned to his men positioned throughout the hall. "Arrest these people. They're enemies of the territory." But Hutchins's men hesitated. Attacking people in the governor's presence, in a courthouse filled with witnesses and reporters, was a line even they wouldn't cross. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Hutchins's authority evaporated before everyone's eyes. Then chaos erupted. One of Hutchins's lawyers, a young man Sebastian didn't recognize, suddenly pulled a derringer from his coat and aimed at it. "Elena, you've destroyed everything," he screamed. "The colonel gave me everything, and you've—" Sebastian moved on pure instinct, his body remembering 3 decades of martial training. He lunged forward, striking the man's arm just as the derringer fired. The bullet went wild, shattering a window. Sebastian twisted the weapon free and pinned the lawyer to the floor as courthouse guards rushed forward. In the confusion, Hutchins made his move. He drew a concealed pistol and backed toward a side door, his weapon trained on the crowd. "No one moves. I'm leaving, and anyone who tries to stop me dies." But he'd forgotten about Eleanor. Despite her injury, she'd positioned herself near that exit. As Hutchins reached for the door handle, she swept his legs with a precise kick that sent him sprawling. His pistol clattered across the floor. Before Hutchins could rise, Maggie was there, her boot pressing firmly on his gun hand. "Stay down, Colonel. Your war is over." Guards surrounded Hutchins, pulling him to his feet and binding his hands. The great Colonel Raymond Hutchins, architect of corruption and murder, had been reduced to a cornered criminal in front of dozens of witnesses. Governor Wallace stood, his voice ringing with authority. "Colonel Raymond Hutchins, you are hereby stripped of rank and placed under arrest pending federal investigation into charges of corruption, land theft, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Bailiffs, take him to the territorial jail." As Hutchins was led away, he locked eyes with Sebastian one final time. The hatred there was absolute, but so was the defeat. "You've won nothing, Drake," Hutchins hissed. "My associates will continue the work. You've only delayed the inevitable." "Maybe," Sebastian replied quietly. "But I've given people hope that justice still exists. And hope is more powerful than any empire you could build." Hutchins was dragged away, still protesting, still threatening. But his words had lost their power. In the aftermath, as the courthouse slowly emptied and reporters rushed off to file their stories, Governor Wallace approached Sebastian and the 3 women. "Mr. Drake," Wallace said, extending his hand, "you've done the territory a great service today. I'm prepared to recommend that your marshal's commission be reinstated." with a formal apology for the circumstances that led to your resignation. Sebastian looked at the offered hand, then at Alina, Maggie, and Elena. These three remarkable women had given him something more valuable than any badge. They'd given him back his honor. "Thank you, Governor," Sebastian said, shaking Wallace's hand. "But I'm not the one who deserves recognition. Mrs. Running Bear spent 3 years pursuing justice for her murdered husband. Dr. Thornton compiled evidence while living in exile, and Elena nearly died protecting these documents. They're the real heroes of this story." Wallace nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps you'd all be willing to work with federal investigators? Your testimony will be crucial in dismantling Hutchins' entire organization. We'll do whatever is necessary," Elena said. "But I have one request, Governor. My husband's name, Thomas Running Bear, needs to be publicly cleared. He died a hero, not a drunk. His sacrifice needs to be remembered. Consider it done," Wallace said solemnly. "I'll personally ensure that his contributions are recognized." As they left the courthouse, stepping into brilliant afternoon sunshine, Sebastian felt lighter than he had in years. The weight of cowardice, guilt, and shame had finally lifted. He would never forget what he'd done or failed to do 3 years ago. But he'd finally found a way to balance the scales. "What will you do now?" Maggie asked him as they walked across the plaza. Sebastian considered the question. His shack in the desert held no appeal anymore. That life, the life of a hermit and coward, was over. But what came next? "I was thinking," he said slowly, looking at the 3 women who'd become his unlikely family, "that the territory could use a dedicated investigation team. Former marshal, experienced healer, and 2 women who know how to track down corruption and fight for justice. We could take cases that regular law enforcement ignores or can't handle. Helping people who have nowhere else to turn," Elena said, understanding lighting her face. "Exactly," Elena smiled, the first genuine smile Sebastian had seen from her. Thomas would have liked that. He always said justice shouldn't depend on whether you're rich or powerful. It should be available to everyone. "Then it's settled," Maggie said with satisfaction. "Though I'm choosing our first case. No more knife wounds, gunfights, or nearly getting killed in courthouses for at least a month. I'm a healer, and all of you need actual rest and recovery." They laughed together. The sound carrying across the plaza. 4 people who'd found redemption through courage, loyalty, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed, Hutchins' network collapsed. Lieutenant Morrison, realizing he had no choice, provided detailed testimony that implicated Judge Blackwood and businessman Garrett Stillwell. Federal investigators swept through the territory, arresting corrupt officials and restoring stolen lands to their rightful owners. The Apache and Navajo families who'd lost their homes received compensation and formal apologies. Thomas Running Bear was posthumously honored by the territorial government, his name inscribed on a memorial dedicated to those who'd fought corruption. And in a small office in Santa Fe, Sebastian Drake hung a new sign, "Drake and Associates, Investigations and Justice," below it. In smaller letters, "In memory of Thomas Running Bear, who taught us that courage is choosing to fight even when you're afraid." Sebastian stood back, admiring the sign, when Alina, Maggie, and Elena joined him. "It's perfect," Alina said softly. "Thomas's legacy will live on through this work." "Through all of us," Sebastian corrected. "He brought us together, even in death. Now we'll honor him by helping others find the justice he never lived to see." As the sun set over Santa Fe, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Sebastian Drake finally understood what redemption truly meant. It wasn't about erasing your mistakes or forgetting your failures. It was about having the courage to stand up again, to keep fighting, and to become the person you always should have been. The office of Drake and Associates had become something unexpected, not just a business, but a sanctuary for the forgotten and the desperate. The front room held 4 desks arranged in a square, allowing the partners to work independently, yet remain connected. Maps covered one wall, marked with ongoing investigations. Filing cabinets held growing records of cases solved and injustices corrected. Their first official case came from an unlikely source, a white rancher named Dutch Calloway, whose daughter had been kidnapped by a gang operating along the Arizona border. The local sheriff claimed there was insufficient evidence to pursue the case. But Sebastian recognized the real reason. The gang's leader was a nephew of one of Hutchins's former associates, a man still wielding enough influence to intimidate local law enforcement. "We don't have jurisdiction," Maggie had pointed out during their initial discussion. "We're not official lawmen anymore." "We have something better," Elena replied. "We have the freedom to go where official law won't." The rescue operation took 2 weeks of careful tracking through brutal desert terrain. Elena, despite her still healing wound, proved invaluable with her knowledge of Apache tracking techniques. They found the gang's hideout in an abandoned mission near the border and managed to extract Calloway's daughter without firing a single shot, a feat Sebastian attributed to careful planning and Elena's ability to negotiate in 3 languages. When they returned the girl safely to her father, Dutch Calloway wept openly. He tried to pay them double their modest fee, but Sebastian refused the extra money. "Justice isn't about profit," he said simply. "It's about making things right." Word spread quickly. A Chinese merchant whose shop had been burned by racist thugs. A freed slave whose land deed was being contested by former Confederate officers. A Mexican family terrorized by claim jumpers. Cases that the official legal system ignored or actively suppressed found their way to the office on San Francisco Street. But not every case ended in triumph. 6 weeks into their operation, they took on the case of Maria Sandoval, a young widow whose husband had been killed in what authorities claimed was a mining accident. Maria insisted it was murder. Her husband had discovered that the mine owner was using child labor in violation of territorial law. The investigation led them to a wealthy mine operator named Cyrus Brennan, a man with connections to the territorial legislature. They gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, documented the unsafe conditions, and the children working 12-hour shifts in darkness. Everything pointed to Brennan ordering the murder to silence a whistleblower. But when they presented their findings to the district prosecutor, they hit a wall. Brennan's lawyers produced counter-evidence, intimidated witnesses into recanting their statements, and filed legal motions that tied the case in procedural knots. Despite their best efforts, Brennan walked free. The failure hit Sebastian hard. He spent 3 days barely speaking, staring at the case files as if he could will them to produce new evidence. It was Elena who finally confronted him. "You're doing it again," she said, entering his office late one evening. "You're taking responsibility for things beyond your control." "We had him," Sebastian said bitterly. "We had evidence, witnesses, everything, and he bought his way out of justice." "The system is corrupt," Elena agreed, sitting across from him. Thomas knew that. It's why he spent years documenting crimes that prosecutors wouldn't prosecute and judges wouldn't hear. But he never stopped trying. He never let one failure erase all the victories. "How did you keep going after he died?" Sebastian asked. "How did you not just give up when the world seemed determined to let evil win?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the worn leather of Thomas's document portfolio that she kept always nearby. "I had a choice," she finally said. "I could let his death be meaningless, or I could make sure that his work, his sacrifice, led to something good. Every person we help, every case we win, is Thomas's legacy continuing. The failures hurt, Sebastian. They hurt terribly, but they don't erase the victories." Sebastian looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd lost everything yet refused to surrender to bitterness. "You're stronger than I'll ever be." "No," Elena said firmly. "I'm just further along in learning to live with loss." "You're still learning, but you're learning, and that's what matters." The next morning, Sebastian wrote a detailed letter to Maria Sandoval, explaining that while they couldn't secure criminal prosecution of Brennan, they'd documented everything. He promised that if Brennan ever made a mistake, and men like him always did, they'd be ready with evidence that couldn't be buried. It wasn't the justice Maria deserved, but it was a promise of continued vigilance. 2 weeks later, Brennan's mine collapsed, killing 3 workers. The federal mine inspector who investigated found the evidence Sebastian had compiled and launched a full investigation. Brennan was arrested, his operations shut down, and the children working in his mines were freed and reunited with their families. Sometimes justice took time. Sometimes it required patience and persistence rather than immediate victory. Sebastian was learning to accept that. Elena had healed remarkably well, though she still experienced occasional pain from her knife wound. She'd thrown herself into the work with fierce dedication, taking on the role of field investigator with natural skill. Her Apache heritage, which some clients initially viewed with suspicion, became one of her greatest assets. She could move through both white and native communities with ease, gathering information that others missed. One afternoon, she returned from interviewing witnesses in a fraud case, her expression troubled. Sebastian looked up from his paperwork. "What's wrong?" "I met someone today," Eleanor said slowly. "An old woman, full-blood Mescalero Apache. She recognized my family name, Running Bear. She said she knew Thomas, that he'd helped her family recover stolen cattle 3 years ago. She wanted me to know that his kindness was remembered, that he was spoken of with honor among the people." Tears streamed down her face, the first time Sebastian had seen her cry since the night she'd arrived at his shack. Wounded and feverish, she said Thomas told her about his wife, about how she was the bravest person he knew. She asked if I was Elena's sister, and when I said yes, she blessed me, said our family carries strong medicine, that we walk the path of those who stand for others even when standing is hard. Elena emerged from the back office, drawn by her sister's voice. When she saw Elena crying, she rushed to embrace her. "It never stops hurting, does it?" Elena whispered, missing him, wishing he could see what we've built, what we're doing in his name. "No," Elena said softly, stroking her sister's hair. "It doesn't stop. But the pain changes. It becomes something we carry with us, not as a burden, but as a reminder of why we fight, why we keep going. Thomas is here, Shidiji. He's here in every case we take, every person we help, every corrupt man we bring to justice." Sebastian and Maggie exchanged glances, giving the sisters their moment of private grief. There was no rushing this kind of healing. Loss left scars that never fully disappeared. You simply learned to live with them, to let them become part of who you were. Maggie had become the administrative backbone of their operation, managing finances, maintaining records, and ensuring they didn't take on more cases than they could handle. But her medical skills remained crucial. She'd treated 3 gunshot wounds, countless injuries from fights, and had even delivered a baby when they'd been investigating a case in a remote mining camp. Her relationship with Sebastian had evolved into something neither of them had fully defined. There was affection, certainly, a deep trust built on shared history and mutual respect. But they'd both been hurt, both carried scars from failed relationships and broken dreams. They worked together with easy familiarity, finding comfort in partnership without the pressure of defining exactly what that partnership meant. One evening, as they closed the office for the day, Maggie paused in the doorway. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Refusing the marshal's commission? You could have had official authority again, respect, a steady government salary." Sebastian considered the question, looking around the modest office that had become more home than any place he'd lived in years. "I spent 20 years wearing a badge that was supposed to mean something. By the end, it was just a piece of metal pinned to a lie. What we do here, helping people who have nowhere else to turn, this means something real. This is the work I should have been doing all along, even though we can't save everyone. Even though men like Brennan sometimes win." "Especially because of that," Sebastian said. "The world needs people willing to fight battles that might not be won, to stand up for justice even when the system is rigged against it. If we only fought fights we knew we'd win, we'd end up fighting for nothing that truly mattered." Maggie smiled, a rare expression of unguarded warmth. "Thomas would have liked you. I wish you'd had more time to work together before. She trailed off, the unspoken ending hanging in the air. I think about that sometimes, Sebastian admitted. What might have been different if I'd been braver 3 years ago? How many lives might have been saved? How much suffering prevented? And then you'd fall into the trap of dwelling on unchangeable past, Maggie said gently. The Sebastian Drake of 3 years ago made the choices he made. You can't go back and fix them. You can only be the man you are now, the one who's helping people, fighting corruption, and honoring Thomas's memory through action rather than regret. They locked the office and walked together through Santa Fe's evening streets, 2 people finding their way forward through shared purpose and the understanding that redemption was a daily choice, not a one-time achievement. 6 months after opening their doors, Drake and Associates received an unexpected visitor, Governor Lew Wallace himself. He arrived without fanfare, entering the office with only a single aide. Governor Wallace, Sebastian said, surprised. What brings you here? Wallace surveyed the office with interest, taking in the maps, case files, and the 4 desks that represented their unlikely partnership. I've been following your work, Mr. Drake. You've solved 17 cases in 6 months, cases that local law enforcement either couldn't or wouldn't handle. You've recovered stolen property, rescued kidnapping victims, exposed fraud, and brought attention to injustices that the official system overlooked. We do what we can, Sebastian said carefully. Unsure sure where this was leading. You do more than that, Wallace corrected. You've created something unique, a bridge between official law enforcement and the people who've lost faith in it. Which is why I'm here with a proposal. He laid out a document on Sebastian's desk. I want to create an official position, Territorial Special Investigator. The commission would give you legal authority to investigate cases across territorial boundaries, access to government resources, and protection under territorial law. But you'd maintain your independence. You'd choose your cases, set your own methods, and report directly to my office rather than through the usual law enforcement channels. Sebastian read the document carefully, then looked at his 3 partners. Can we have a moment to discuss this? Wallace nodded and stepped outside with his aide. It's what you wanted, Maggie said immediately. Official authority without being trapped in a corrupt system. It's a compromise, Alina added. We'd have more resources, but also more oversight, more ability to help people, but also more restrictions on how we operate. Elena spoke last, her voice thoughtful. Thomas always said that real change happens both inside and outside the system. You need people working within the official structures and people working around them. Maybe we're meant to be both. Sebastian thought about the young marshal he'd once been, idealistic, believing that badges and laws were enough to ensure justice. Then he thought about the broken man he'd become, hiding in the desert and pretending the world's problems weren't his concern. And finally, he thought about who he was now, someone who'd learned that justice required courage, compassion, and the willingness to operate in the messy space between perfect legality and moral necessity. We take the commission, he said finally, but on our terms. We maintain our independence. We choose our cases based on need rather than political convenience. And we never compromise our principles for the sake of official approval. They called Governor Wallace back in and negotiated for an hour, hammering out terms that preserved their autonomy while giving them legitimate authority. When Wallace finally left, Sebastian held the signed commission in his hands. But this time, the badge meant something different. It wasn't a symbol of naive idealism or corrupt power. It was a tool, nothing more and nothing less, that could be used to help people who needed help. That night, the 4 of them gathered in the office to celebrate their new status. Maggie had brought wine, a rarity, and they toasted their success with a mixture of satisfaction and cautious optimism. To Thomas Running Bear, Sebastian said, raising his glass, who started this fight and gave us the courage to continue it. To justice, Alina added. The real kind, not the kind written in law books but ignored in practice. To second chances, Maggie said, and the wisdom to use them well. To family, Elena finished, looking at each of them in turn. Not the family we were born into, but the family we've chosen, bound not by blood, but by shared purpose and unshakable loyalty. They drank together. 4 people who'd been broken by loss, betrayal and failure, now forged into something stronger. Through their determination to stand for something meaningful. He'd been a coward who pretended to sleep while terrible things happened around him, but those days were over. Now, Sebastian Drake was wide awake, and he was ready to fight for every person who needed someone, to stand beside them in their darkest hour. The cowboy who'd tested the Apache sisters had learned the greatest lesson of all, that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from finding the courage to stand together, and together they would change the West, one case, one victory, one act of justice at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.